Ethan sat at the small wooden desk tucked in the back corner of the bookstore, staring at the blank page in front of him. His fingers itched to write, to craft the kind of words that poured out of his soul when no one was watching. Outside the store, the city buzzed with life, but Ethan felt worlds away from it. He preferred to exist in the quiet, where his thoughts could run free, unjudged. Writing anonymous love letters had become his secret ritual. It was easier to express feelings to no one in particular, imagining that someone out there might find comfort in his words. Each letter, a small piece of himself, was left in a book, on a park bench, or tucked inside a coffee shop menu. He hoped somehow those words could connect him to people in a way he couldn't manage face to face. Across town, Grace sat in her tiny apartment, her camera resting untouched on the table. Since her last relationship ended, she felt adrift. The weight of the emotional scars still pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe sometimes. Trusting someone again seemed impossible. She glanced out the window, watching life move past without her. What was the point of going out? But she couldn't help but wonder if there was something, someone, that might bring back the hope she had lost. It was a cold afternoon when Grace decided to venture out for coffee, hoping that a change of scenery might shake her from the melancholy that had settled over her. The familiar hum of the cafe felt comforting as she sipped her drink, trying to lose herself in the routine of people watching. She needed distraction, something to shift her mind away from the lingering pain of the past. As she reached for a napkin, her fingers brushed against something unfamiliar, folded paper, tucked beneath the sugar jar. Curious, she picked it up and unfolded it, revealing a handwritten letter. The inked words on the page were simple yet raw, speaking of longing, of missed chances, and of the kind of love that leaves an aching void when it's gone. Grace's heart skipped a beat. Whoever had written this letter seemed to understand the pain she had been carrying, even if they hadn't intended it for her. The handwriting was shaky, as if the writer had poured his emotions onto the page quickly, perhaps nervously. She scanned the room, but no one seemed out of place. No one looked like the mysterious author. The letter felt intimate, as though it had been written directly to her. She slipped it into her pocket and left the cafe, a small flicker of intrigue sparking within her, something she hadn't felt in months. As she walked home, the world around her seemed just a little less gray. Back at her apartment, Grace couldn't stop thinking about the letter. The words replayed in her mind like a song she couldn't shake. The vulnerability in them was striking, as if someone had dared to open their soul to the world, hoping someone might listen. She read it again that night, tracing the lines with her fingertips, wondering what kind of person would leave such a heartfelt piece of themselves for a stranger to find. The next day, she returned to the same cafe. She didn't know what she was hoping to accomplish, but the thought of connecting with someone, even anonymously, gave her a strange sense of purpose. She sat down with her coffee, pulled out a piece of paper, and hesitated. What could she say in return? Her fingers hovered over the page before she finally began to write. Her message was brief, just a simple thank you, acknowledging how much the letter had touched her and made her feel less alone. As she wrote, she imagined the person reading it, wondering who they were, what had driven them to write such intimate thoughts. Grace left her note where she had found the original letter and walked out, a mixture of nervousness and excitement swirling inside her. It felt like a small act, but it was something. A step toward breaking the walls she had built around herself. 2 days later, Ethan walked into the cafe for his usual morning coffee. As he reached for the sugar, his eyes caught sight of the folded paper. He unfolded it carefully, his heart pounding as he read the response. Someone had found his letter. Not only had they read his words, but they had taken the time to reply. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a connection forming that he hadn't anticipated. His letters had always been a solitary act. He never expected them to reach someone in such a meaningful way. Without hesitation, he wrote another letter, longer this time, revealing a bit more of himself, but still maintaining his anonymity. He wanted to share more, to open up even if he couldn't do it face to face. Over the next few weeks, their letters continued, each one a little more personal, a little deeper. They wrote about their dreams, their regrets, their fears. They never signed their names, but through their words, they revealed pieces of their souls. Grace found herself looking forward to each new letter. There was a sincerity in the writing that drew her in, a gentleness she hadn't encountered in a long time. Whoever this person was, they understood the quiet pain she carried. And with each letter, that connection grew stronger. With every new exchange, Grace felt the intensity of her emotions growing. The more she learned about the person behind the letters, the more she wanted to meet them. Their connection had moved beyond the page, and she found herself wondering what they looked like, what their voice sounded like. She was drawn to the vulnerability he showed in his writing, but the mystery gnawed at her. The fear of disappointment, however, lingered in the back of her mind. What if he wasn't who she imagined? What if the reality of meeting in person didn't match the bond they had created through their words? It was a risk she wasn't sure she was ready to take. She considered writing him directly, asking to meet, but something held her back. The anonymity was part of the magic. On the other side of the exchange, Ethan grappled with his own fears. He knew it was only a matter of time before she asked to meet. The thought terrified him. How could he, the quiet bookstore clerk, possibly live up to her expectations? What if, when she saw him, the connection they had built through their letters crumbled? One afternoon, Grace decided to visit a nearby bookstore. She had been feeling restless, and the idea of browsing through books appealed to her. As she wandered through the aisles, her attention was caught by the young man behind the counter. He looked familiar, though she couldn't place why. Ethan was busy cataloging books when Grace walked in. He glanced up, his heart skipping a beat as he recognized her. She was the woman from the cafe, the one who had been finding and responding to his letters. His pulse quickened, but he kept his head down, unsure of how to act. Did she have any idea who he was? Grace approached the counter to ask about a book, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, but she dismissed it just as quickly. She smiled politely, and Ethan felt his throat tighten. He could have said something. He could have told her the truth, but the fear of ruining everything held him back. As she left the bookstore, Grace couldn't shake the strange feeling that the man behind the counter seemed familiar. But she dismissed the thought, focusing instead on the next letter she hoped to find waiting for her at the cafe. As the letters between them continued, Grace felt the intensity of her emotions grow. Each letter revealed more of the person behind the words, and with every new revelation, her desire to meet him in person deepened. But there was also a growing sense of unease. Why hadn't he suggested meeting yet? Was he hiding something? The more she thought about it, the more doubts crept in. What if he wasn't who she thought he was? The possibility gnawed at her, and the thrill of their letters began to be overshadowed by anxiety. She considered writing him directly, asking to meet, but a part of her hesitated. What if meeting face-to-face shattered the fragile connection they had? Meanwhile, Ethan was battling his own demons. Every day that passed, he knew he was running out of time. The letters, once his escape, now felt like a weight pulling him down. He wanted to meet her, but the fear of disappointing her, of losing her, was paralyzing. Revealing himself meant exposing his insecurities, his flaws. The pressure had become unbearable. Ethan knew he couldn't continue hiding behind the letters forever. It wasn't fair to Grace, and it wasn't fair to the connection they had built. She deserved to know the truth. So one evening, with trembling hands, he wrote what would be his final anonymous letter. In the letter, Ethan confessed everything. He admitted his fear of rejection, his insecurity about not living up to her expectations. He told her how much her letters had meant to him, and how deeply they had touched him in ways he hadn't expected. But he also knew that their relationship couldn't continue like this, not without the truth. He ended the letter with a simple invitation, a time and place to meet. No more hiding, no more words on paper, just the truth, face to face. He folded the letter carefully and left it at their usual spot in the cafe, feeling a mix of hope and dread. When Grace found the letter the next morning, her heart raced. She had been waiting for this moment, yet now that it was here, she felt a rush of uncertainty. What if he wasn't the person she had imagined? What if everything changed? Despite her fears, she knew she had to meet him. She needed to know if the connection they had built through words could translate into something real. Grace arrived at the cafe earlier than planned, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation. She kept scanning the room, wondering which of the faces she saw might belong to the person who had shared so much of himself through his letters. She clutched the final note in her hand, the one that had invited her here, uncertain of what awaited her. Ethan arrived minutes later, just as he had promised. He spotted her immediately, sitting by the window, a faint look of apprehension on her face. Every step toward her felt heavier than the last, his nerves frayed and raw. When he finally reached her table, Grace looked up, her breath catching as she recognized him. It was Ethan, the quiet bookstore clerk she had interacted with briefly before. Her mind spun, trying to process the revelation. She had never expected him to be the one behind the letters. He seemed so different from the image she had built in her head, yet, in a way, the same. His shy demeanor, the vulnerability she had sensed in his words, it all made sense now. For a moment, they both stood there, unsure of what to say. Ethan swallowed hard, then broke the silence. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I was afraid you wouldn't want to meet me if you knew who I was." Grace hesitated, her emotions swirling. She had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was happening, reality felt different. But as she looked at him, the sincerity in his eyes, the honesty of his words, it was all still there, just as it had been in the letters. Slowly, she smiled. "I'm glad you did." Months had passed since that day in the cafe, and life for Ethan and Grace had changed in ways they could never have imagined. They now spent their days together, learning to navigate the reality of the connection they had once only shared through letters. Their bond had deepened, and the hesitations and insecurities that once held them back had slowly faded. Even now, they still exchanged letters, not out of necessity, but as a playful reminder of how their relationship had begun. Small notes were left in books Ethan would hand her, or in pockets of jackets Grace would leave for him to find. Each letter carried a piece of their journey, a continuation of the love that had bloomed through written words. But it didn't stop there. They also continued leaving anonymous letters around the city, hoping to spark the same sense of connection and wonder they had found. Every note they left was a reminder of the power of vulnerability, of reaching out even when fear threatened to hold them back. Together, they walked the city streets, their fingers intertwined, knowing that what had once been invisible between them was now real, solid, and unbreakable.